I've seen organizations where even if they started with a hiring program, that program existed in a silo of a particular business unit. They were really bought in. They made 1 or 2 hires. They trained up their managers. They did a good job, but they didn't branch out to any of those other elements like executive buy-in, like training other departments, like examining their policies and their accommodations and their internal resources. It kind of was a one and done, a one pillar, and check the box, great, we did neurodiversity. And that program never went anywhere.
Right. Hi, welcome to the Neurodiversity in the Workplace podcast. I'm Joe, and I have Sean here with me. Sean, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to take a look at a couple of different companies' approaches to building their neurodiversity program. And every company's culture and situation is a little bit different. Every company takes a slightly different approach, but we're going to see some that have worked really well, some that have not worked so well. And the general takeaway that we're going to see here is that building structures that last require multiple pillars to stand on. So what do we mean by that? We're going to look at a couple of examples. We're going to take one of our partners that has built a really lasting, sustainable, strong program. And so what went into the beginning and the growth of that program? The one that I want to talk about started with a very small hiring cohort, a group of employees that really cared about the topic and wanted to take some action. They reached out to us. We aligned a couple of positions, a couple managers that wanted to take part. We did a hiring event. Great. The program is up and running. We got, I want to say, 6 or 7 hires out of that. That was the initial building block. But then over the subsequent, at this point, 5 or 6 years after that point, that company has continued working with us to explore new areas, new pillars to build their program on. So that has included embedding training into their LMS. That has included doing events, both internal and external facing. They have looped in their executive leadership, gotten a lot of buy-in, gotten a lot of visibility within the company, and we've branched out to different business units that have done hiring through the program, have participated in training. I think branched out is a really good way to kind of summarize where those different pillars have gone, and that has been the key ingredient to success of that program, building and sustaining over years and years through a lot of different changes within and without the organization. So,
right. And I think if I could build off of that, I think when we're looking at this, to create change in an organization, part of our goal, and if you're listening, hopefully your goal too, is to create a more neuro-inclusive workforce, making sure that people who think and learn and socialize and experience the world differently feel welcomed and also kind of celebrated and accepted into the workplace as we know it. Whereas so much of the modern workplace is, here's how we're going to do the task, and here's how you should do the task too, and kind of this repetitive motion of not allowing people to truly be themselves. And so to be able to change, to adjust towards that, we have to be able to attack it from multiple angles or pillars, like you said. Mm-hmm. And so for any cultural change or any systems change or organizational change, you need a couple of different key areas where you're kind of attacking that problem, right?
Yeah, and cultural change can't be one-dimensional.
Right, and just doing a hiring event is not going to change a culture.
No.
It might drastically inform a culture or persuade a culture.
And it's a great accomplishment.
Yeah, it's definitely a great accomplishment.
But it's not the end.
Right, exactly. And so when we take a couple steps back into looking at what those pillars that you mentioned are, we've got the hiring program that we mentioned, right? And I always find that the most successful programs surrounding neuroinclusion include a hiring aspect, because we go into other organizations and we might do a training, for example, right? And say, here's the key strategies to making neuroinclusion. But without the hiring process, you don't get to kind of have that real world example of people who are saying, hey, I am neurodivergent and I want this different process.
You don't get to apply the things that are in that training.
Right, and you don't get to apply them immediately, which
Right.
I think is a big difference. I'm sure there are neurodivergent people already within your organization and you are applying them without knowing in a lot of different areas. But if you're not applying them immediately, you're not getting to practice that and understand that you're practicing it, right? And so we find that the most successful programs have that hiring component. And
The other thing that I
No, go
think
on.
is important about the hiring component is, let's say, training is training. Accommodations are accommodations. But hiring involves all these things. If you're going to hire people, you're going to train their managers, you're going to learn about accommodations as they're onboarding and discovering their needs. You're going to learn about navigating disclosure as those individuals are kind of figuring out, how and who and where to disclose where they're comfortable. So that pillar itself, even though it's one pillar, it involves all the other ones too.
Right, exactly. And I think that when we have that hiring component in place, like you're saying, we can test all of the other components, but then you quickly start to see all of the connections to other areas of the organization where you can start to inform some change. Another big area or pillar that we look at is systemic change or like policy change. These are the kinds of things where we look at what is the appropriate accommodation request system. If for both external and internal employees or job applicants, right? If you're applying to a company and you have the ability to say, I would like to alter the interview in some way, that's a huge game changer for your ability to access that company in an accessible way, and for the company to be able to access you, who might think and learn and socialize a little bit differently.
Yeah,
And so,
if that's not an option at an employer, then they're missing out on a huge population of applicants.
right, a lot of talent who would just like some slight adjustments in how the typical interview process is created or run.
And I think a common pitfall is when people think about accommodations, depending on their role, they think about accommodations for employees and forget about those external that you mentioned. Or if you're in recruiting, you're really only thinking about accommodations for interviewers. And so seeing where that overlaps and learning from one and applying it to the other, we try to do that in our programs, but that gets overlooked by a lot of people.
Yeah, and then moving when you're actually inside the company, looking at the systems for accommodations. Very often we can have simple accommodations that are able to be adjusted in terms of removing the documentation required for it. It's like a simple, easy, oftentimes free thing that we can just say, okay, if anyone requests this, this is just an accessible thing that we can create and make available. And we see that pipeline from accommodation to accessible technologies and accessible processes. That should be flowing really easily. And that's one of the big focuses that we look at is that process flowing? Is it going from accommodation to accessibility, and us treating the whole environment as something that can be improved instead of looking at it more in a medicalized way and saying, okay, this one person has requested this one process change, so we can make that, but without taking the time to say, actually, let's evaluate how many people likely need this. And why are they not asking for it? And how can we implement it, especially if it's easily implementable?
Right, because if you just support that one person's request, it's going to take steps A through E, and you might meet that request. But what happens the next time somebody has that same need? It's going to take all those same steps. Whereas if you really kind of observe and learn from that first employee or that first candidate, think about it and activate that in your existing policy like you talked about, then for the next employee or candidate, it's only going to require 3 steps or 2 steps or 1 step.
And this is a huge part of culture change and creating those pillars. If we're looking at things as to how much more systems and processes can we make it more accessible, we're really trying to unlock more productivity from our talent that exists within an organization, right? Because an accommodation, our definition, is usually a tool to do your job. That's what it is. It often is associated with, some sort of disability, but it doesn't have to be. We all use tools every day to do our job. If we're looking at, okay, which tools do we give to who, and you can generalize these people as a group, this whole population of employees working on X topic likely need this tool as well or could benefit from this tool. Why not look at that pipeline? And so there's this whole area of innovation that lives within that accommodation to accessibility pipeline that I think we really try to look at how can we speed that up and make them more interconnected. Because that's another thing in a lot of companies, they're very different divisions that talk about and run those operations.
Cool. So let's talk about some other of those pillars, right? To just identify, when we've seen programs thrive, we've talked about hiring, we've talked about training, we've talked about accommodations and processes. But something else that is kind of a red thread with a lot of our partners is leadership buy-in, whether that is from the outset of the program, if it starts from, a call to action from the CHRO, then great, you already have that. But sometimes programs start with just, an ERG or BRG or just a particular department head that wants to kind of go out on a limb and start this effort and then needs to find the buy-in later. So what benefit is there to having that executive buy-in? What impact does that make on the sustainability of a program? And maybe, how does one, if they don't yet have that buy-in, seek it out?
Yeah, so leaders in especially larger organizations, but any organization, can flatten the road bumps that pop up for people, right? If something is blocking progress towards an accommodation process, an accessibility process, a hiring process, a training process, et cetera, all those processes, the leadership can make the decision to say, you know what, we're going to get that done anyway.
Yeah.
Really productive, really helpful to have that buy-in. Whereas if you don't have that buy-in, you have to kind of constantly go through this approvals chain.
Yeah, talk
to
to
get
person A and B and C and get a thumbs up every single step of the way, and it takes a whole year to make one change that a certain individual might be able to just unilaterally make it happen.
Right, exactly. And I think that leadership brings us to another pillar, which is the idea of psychological safety. And this is an organization that feels comfortable talking about things within their own organization.
Right.
It's if you're afraid to bring things up because you feel like it will be responded by leadership usually in a negative way. This is where you become an unsafe psychologically, an organization that doesn't have that psychological safety. And we've seen examples of this. We've been in organizations where we're either doing a training or working more deeply, where even the way that people respond to leaders who are in the room shows you a lot, where you see, okay, there's some uncomfortable interactions here where people clearly are not saying what they're thinking. They're not contributing to the conversation based off of what they actually want to say. They're contributing to the conversation based off of what they think the leadership wants them to say. And this is one of the most fascinating things about what we do. We go into so many different cultures within different organizations. And this, I think, is one of the more evident things that you can see from the outside of how do people respond to the leaders in the room or in the conversation. Are they frightened? Are they worried? Are they panicked how that person will react? Or do they generally think that that person has their best interest, the best interest of the community, the best interest of the company in mind?
Yeah.
Big difference.
I've heard from a number of our partners, and that might be a program lead that's trying to make this cultural change in their organization. But I'm also thinking of like some managers that we've worked with that are just kind of like procedurally involved in our efforts. Like they just hired somebody, had to learn about the topic, but their whole life is not dedicated to neurodiversity. They're just happening to be a part of it and a beneficiary of it. And so I've heard from a number of these people that the leaders that stand out to them, that do the best job and yield the best teams, are the ones that put people first instead of deliverables or instead of themselves. The leaders that kind of ask questions of their teams and care about the well-being of their teams. It feels a little like counterintuitive when it's all about results and the bottom line and delivering products. But I've really heard time and time again, I think this is just kind of a leadership truth, that to care about your people is the best way to get your deliverables accomplished. And I think that applies for creating a psychologically safe culture and a neuro-inclusive culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another pillar, shifting the gears.
We're building quite a building
here.
A
lot of pillars. Would be training, which is kind of the easiest one to go to. Usually the first one that people will go to because we say the word so many times a day, neurodiversity. What does it mean? And training is a really helpful way to help decipher that to a wider audience. However, training alone is somewhat unproductive. We find that when we just do trainings, nothing really changes. There's no.
It's in one ear, out the other. I think on its own, it's just an hour of your day.
Right.
But if it is alongside people being hired or policies being changed, then like you said, you get to apply these things that you learn in like a lecture or a workshop. Once you get to actually employ it in your day to day, it carries that much more weight and it makes that much more difference.
Right, 100%. And I think that we also are exposed to so many trainings in our modern world.
There's definitely a saturation issue.
Yeah, there's a lot of information always flowing at us. And so we just won't put it into action without some programmatic elements that are paired with this. And this goes along with some of the best suggestions of how to make organizational change happen. It's more than just awareness. It's more than just a training on the topic. You have to implement some roadmaps, some strategies, some pillars, to be able to do that.
So, okay, we've built this building. We've established kind of what we think the neuro-inclusive organization of the future looks like. Great. I do want to kind of get out of the dream scenario a little bit and say, like, okay, why are we doing all of this? What happens if we don't? And I can share some examples that I've seen other organizations not take an approach like I described, a multi-pillared approach. I've seen organizations where even if they started with a hiring program, that program existed in a silo of a particular business unit. They were really bought in. They made 1 or 2 hires, they trained up their managers, they did a good job, but they didn't branch out to any of those other elements like executive buy-in, like training other departments, like examining their policies and their accommodations and their internal resources. It kind of was a one and done, a one pillar, and check the box, great, we did neurodiversity, and that program never went anywhere.
Right.
And that's what happens, if you don't touch all these different elements, then the program becomes a dead end. The effort doesn't really go anywhere, and where you could have built a growing, flourishing program that changes culture, like we're talking about, what you did was bring 2 people in the door and change the culture of one small team. And unfortunately, that's great for that team, but it's not great for the organization.
And it might not even be that great for those 2 people brought in if the rest of the organization doesn't have a psychologically safe environment.
Their safe space remains very small.
Right. And so, yeah, lots of challenges when it's just hiring. It has to be connected. And for those of you who are listening, if you're thinking, okay, how do I make this happen within my own organizations? One easy way is to work with an external support system like Neurodiversity in the Workplace. Shameless plug. But I think that on the other hand is look at these different ways. Look at other programming that has made an impact within your organization and try to mirror that. Look at how you can change some of these processes, but know that they have to be brought forward together, that there's a strategy of bringing multiple pillars to the front. I don't know if you can bring pillars anywhere, but yeah.
In this analogy, you can.
Okay,
I feel
great.
like
they're movable pillars.
We have heroically carried this analogy, this metaphor through this whole discussion.
Yeah, I like it.
But I think we need to call it on the metaphor. But hopefully it has been made clear that, to build a neuro-inclusive culture, to change culture, you can't do it with one pillar, with one area of focus. You really have to branch out. You have to build a multi-tiered, stable structure to stand on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, This has been fun for me to talk about. I hope that you all enjoyed listening to us talk about this. We literally talk about this all day long. So, but anyway, thank you so much for listening to the NITW podcast, and please be sure to like and subscribe so that you can hear more.